Karen Thompson had always been the kind of person who liked things neat and tidy. In her quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone kept their lawns perfectly trimmed and their driveways spotless, Karen stood out, not because she was particularly friendly or charming, but because she was, well, intense. If you lived on Maple Street, chances are you'd heard about Karen long before you ever met her. She wasn't just a member of the Homeowners Association, HOA. She practically ran it with an iron fist. The HOA meetings were legendary in the neighborhood. Every second Thursday of the month, Karen would sit at the head of the table, armed with a clipboard, a stack of papers, and an unshakable belief that she knew best. Her rules weren't suggestions, they were laws. No Christmas lights after January 15th. Mailboxes had to be painted white, not cream. And don't even think about putting up a garden gnome without written permission. Most people found her nitpicking exhausting, but they went along with it because, honestly, Karen's strictness did keep the neighborhood looking nice. Still, there was something about her that made your skin crawl. A little too much control, a little too much enthusiasm for enforcing rules. But one day, Karen's usual antics took a strange turn. It started when a crew of construction workers showed up to fix a water main near her house. They worked all morning, digging trenches and laying pipes, until one of them stopped mid-scoop. "Hey," he said, leaning on his shovel. "Do you hear that?" The rest of the crew paused, listening. From somewhere below the ground came a faint rumbling sound like distant thunder, or maybe someone moving heavy objects underground. At first, they thought it might be vibrations from their own equipment, but when they turned off the machines, the noise didn't stop. Word got around quickly. By lunchtime, half the neighborhood was standing in Karen's driveway, craning their necks toward the source of the mysterious sound. When Karen finally emerged from her house wearing her signature floral print dress and sensible shoes, she looked annoyed. "What's going on here?" she demanded, hands on her hips. A few brave souls stepped forward to explain what the workers had heard. Instead of offering an explanation, Karen waved them off. "It's nothing," she snapped. "Probably just some old pipes shifting. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Her dismissive attitude only fueled the gossip mill. Over the next few days, neighbors began noticing odd things happening around Karen's property. Piles of dirt appeared overnight near her backyard shed, as though someone had been digging and hastily covering their tracks. At first, people assumed she was working on a new landscaping project. Karen loved her flower beds, but the sheer volume of soil seemed excessive. Then there were the strange noises, muffled thuds and scraping sounds late at night, audible through open windows. Some residents joked that Karen must be building a bomb shelter, while others whispered darker theories. Was she hiding something? Or someone? Curiosity eventually got the better of a small group of neighbors led by Greg, a retired mechanic who lived 2 doors down. Greg had never been a fan of Karen's overbearing ways, and this latest mystery gave him an excuse to poke around. One evening, under the cover of darkness, he and a couple of friends crept into Karen's backyard. The shed door was locked, but a quick peek behind it revealed something shocking. A gaping hole in the ground, partially covered by a tarp. Beneath, the tarp was the entrance to what looked like a tunnel. Greg couldn't believe his eyes. He snapped a few photos with his phone before hurrying back home, heart racing. The next morning, the pictures circulated among the neighbors like wildfire. Everyone had questions. Why would Karen dig a tunnel? Where did it lead? And most importantly, how deep did it go? For a woman obsessed with order and appearances, this was completely out of character. Yet as wild as the discovery seemed, no one could deny the evidence staring them in the face. By noon, a crowd had gathered outside Karen's house, buzzing with speculation. Someone knocked on her door, and after a long pause, Karen answered, looking flustered. "What is this about?" she asked, glaring at the sea of faces. One of the neighbors held up Greg's photo. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his tone accusatory. Karen hesitated, clearly caught off guard. For a moment, it seemed like she might deny everything, but then she sighed and stepped aside. "Come in," she muttered reluctantly. Inside, Karen sat stiffly on her couch, avoiding eye contact as the neighbors pressed her for answers. Finally, she admitted to digging the tunnel, but not for any sinister reason, she insisted. According to Karen, she'd stumbled across online forums discussing government surveillance drones flying over residential areas. Convinced that her privacy was at risk, she decided to take matters into her own hands. "I wanted to create a safe space," she explained, her voice trembling slightly. "Somewhere we could protect ourselves if things got bad." The room fell silent. Safe space? Protect themselves? To the neighbors, it sounded less like preparation and more like paranoia, but Karen refused to back down, insisting that her intentions were good, even if her methods were questionable. As the crowd dispersed, shaking their heads in disbelief, one thing was clear: Karen's obsession with control had spiraled far beyond mailbox colors and lawn ornaments. This was something else entirely, something bigger, and nobody knew quite what to do about it. As the days passed, Karen's backyard became the center of attention in the neighborhood. What had once been a quiet cul-de-sac now felt like the set of a mystery movie. Neighbors whispered behind fences, pointing toward Karen's house whenever they thought she wasn't looking. The discovery of the tunnel entrance had sent shockwaves through the community, and no one could stop talking about it. Some people joked that Karen was building a secret lair to rule the world, while others speculated more seriously about her mental state. Whatever the truth was, it was clear that Karen's behavior had crossed into uncharted territory. At first, Karen tried to play down the situation. She insisted that the tunnel was nothing more than a personal project, a hobby as she called it. But her vague explanations only raised more questions. How deep did the tunnel go? Where did it lead? And why on earth would someone spend their free time digging underground when they could be doing, well, anything else? The neighbors weren't buying her story, especially since the pile of dirt near her shed kept growing larger by the day. Something big was happening beneath Karen's property, and everyone wanted answers. The tension came to a head during the next HOA meeting. Normally, these gatherings were dull affairs filled with discussions about fence heights and holiday decorations. This time, however, the room buzzed with energy. People packed into Karen's living room, sitting shoulder to shoulder on couches and chairs. A few even brought folding stools from home, determined not to miss a moment of the drama. Greg, the retired mechanic who had discovered the tunnel, stood at the front of the group holding up his phone with the photos he'd taken. "This isn't just some harmless hobby," he said, his voice firm. "We need to know what's really going on here." Karen sat stiffly in her usual spot at the head of the room, clutching a cup of tea like it was a lifeline. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she listened to the accusations flying around her. For the first time in years, she didn't seem to have all the answers, or at least she wasn't willing to share them. When Greg finished speaking, the room erupted into murmurs. One neighbor suggested calling the police, while another proposed hiring a professional engineer to inspect the property. Karen finally broke her silence, raising her hand to quiet the crowd. "I already told you," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "It's nothing dangerous, just leave it alone." But leaving it alone wasn't an option anymore. The very next morning, a group of concerned residents decided to investigate further. Armed with flashlights, gloves, and a healthy dose of curiosity, they gathered at Karen's backyard shed. She wasn't home, probably out running errands or avoiding the growing scrutiny, and this gave them the perfect opportunity to take a closer look. They pulled back the tarp covering the tunnel entrance and peered inside. At first glance, it looked like any ordinary hole in the ground, dark, damp, and slightly ominous. But as they shone their flashlights deeper, they realized it was much more than that. The tunnel stretched farther than anyone expected, disappearing into the earth like a snake burrowing into its den. Its walls were rough and uneven, clearly dug by hand rather than with machinery. Wooden beams braced the ceiling every few feet, giving the impression that Karen had put considerable effort into keeping the structure stable. Still, the air smelled musty and the floor was slick with mud, making it clear that this wasn't exactly a safe environment. Despite the risks, Greg led the way, stepping cautiously into the darkness. Behind him, the others followed in single file, their footsteps echoing softly against the narrow passage. As they ventured deeper, the group began to notice strange details. Small alcoves had been carved into the sides of the tunnel, each one filled with supplies, bottled water, canned food, blankets, and even a first aid kit. It was as though Karen had been preparing for some kind of disaster, or maybe hiding from one. In one particularly large chamber, they found a makeshift table and chairs, along with stacks of books and maps pinned to the walls. The maps showed detailed plans of the neighborhood, complete with notes scrawled in Karen's handwriting. Some areas were circled in red, while others had arrows pointing outward, as if marking escape routes. The discovery left the group stunned. This wasn't just a random excavation. It was a fully functional underground bunker. As they made their way back to the surface, their minds raced with possibilities. Was Karen planning for a doomsday scenario? Had she uncovered something suspicious about the neighborhood or even the government that she didn't want anyone else to know? Or was this simply the result of years of unchecked paranoia? No one could say for sure, but one thing was certain. Karen's tunnel was far bigger and more elaborate than anyone had imagined. When they emerged from the tunnel, blinking in the sunlight, the group exchanged uneasy glances. What should they do now? Confront Karen directly? Report her to the authorities? Or keep quiet and hope the whole situation blew over? Before they could decide, they heard the crunch of gravel underfoot. Turning, they saw Karen standing at the edge of her driveway, staring at them with wide eyes. She looked furious, not because they had invaded her privacy, but because they had uncovered her secret. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Karen stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "How dare you?" She spat, her voice shaking. "That's private property. You had no right to go down there." The group shuffled uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. Greg finally stepped forward, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Karen, we're not trying to cause trouble," he said calmly. "We're just worried about what you've built. This isn't normal behavior, and you know it." Karen crossed her arms tightly over her chest, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. "You don't understand," she muttered. "None of you do." And with that, she turned on her heel and stormed back into the house, slamming the door behind her. The neighbors stood in stunned silence, watching as the curtains twitched closed. Whatever Karen's reasons were for digging the tunnel, she clearly wasn't ready to share them. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows lengthened across the yard, one thing was painfully obvious. This bizarre chapter in their neighborhood's history was far from over. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with activity. Word of the tunnel's discovery had spread like wildfire, and it seemed like everyone had an opinion about what Karen had been up to. Some people were genuinely concerned about safety, while others couldn't resist indulging in wild speculation. Was Karen preparing for some kind of apocalyptic event? Or was she hiding something, or someone, down there? Theories ranged from the plausible to the absurd, but one thing was certain. The quiet suburban life they'd all grown accustomed to was suddenly anything but. Karen, for her part, stayed inside her house with the blinds drawn. Her car remained, parked in the driveway, untouched, and no one saw her come or go. It was as if she had retreated into her own little world, shutting out the chaos brewing outside. But the neighbors weren't about to let her off the hook that easily. A small group of them decided to pay her another visit, not to accuse her this time, but to try and get some answers. They figured that maybe, just maybe, a calm and reasonable conversation would help them understand why Karen had gone to such extreme lengths. When they knocked on her door, it took several minutes before Karen finally answered. She looked tired, her usually immaculate appearance replaced by disheveled hair and wrinkled clothes. Her eyes darted nervously between the faces at her doorstep, and for a moment, it seemed like she might slam the door in their faces. Instead, she sighed heavily and stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in. "Fine," she said, her voice flat. "Ask your questions." Inside, the air was thick with tension. Karen sat stiffly on the edge of her couch, clutching a mug of tea that had long gone cold. Across from her, Greg and a few other neighbors settled into chairs, exchanging uneasy glances. No one wanted to be the first to speak, so Greg eventually cleared his throat and leaned forward. Karen, he began gently, we're not here to judge you. We need to know what's going on. Why did you build that tunnel? For a long moment, Karen didn't respond. She stared down at her hands, twisting the handle of the mug until her knuckles turned white. Then, slowly, she began to talk, not in her usual clipped, authoritative tone, but in a softer, almost hesitant voice. I didn't mean for it to get this big, she admitted, her words spilling out in a rush. It started small, a little project to protect myself and my family, but then, I don't know. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, it was bigger than I ever intended. She went on to explain how it all began. About 6 months ago, Karen stumbled across online forums discussing government surveillance drones flying over residential areas. At first, she dismissed the posts as conspiracy theories, but the more she read, the more unsettled she became. What if those drones really were watching them? What if their privacy was being invaded without their knowledge? The idea gnawed at her, keeping her awake at night. She convinced herself that she needed to do something, anything, to safeguard her home and her community. At first, the plan was simple: dig a small underground shelter where she could store emergency supplies and stay safe in case of trouble. But as she worked on the project, her vision expanded. She imagined creating an entire network of tunnels, connecting different parts of the neighborhood so people could move around undetected if necessary. In her mind, it wasn't just about protecting herself. It was about protecting everyone. I thought I was doing the right thing, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I thought I was helping. The room fell silent as Karen finished speaking. Her story was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. On one hand, it was hard not to admire her determination and resourcefulness. Digging a tunnel by hand required an incredible amount of effort, and the fact that she had done it mostly alone was impressive. But on the other hand, her logic was flawed, at best. The idea that a sprawling underground labyrinth could somehow shield the neighborhood from surveillance drones was frankly ridiculous. And yet, sitting there listening to her, it was clear that Karen truly believed in what she was doing. To her, this wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. As the group processed what they'd heard, Greg spoke up again. Karen, I get that you were trying to help, he said carefully. But have you thought about the risks? Tunnels can collapse, especially when they're dug by someone without experience. And what about the structural damage to the houses above? You've put a lot of people in danger. Karen flinched at his words, her face reddening. I didn't think it would cause any harm, she insisted. I was careful. I reinforced the walls, I checked for stability. Everything was fine until her voice trailed off and she looked away, guilt flashing across her features. For the first time, it seemed like she was beginning to realize the gravity of what she'd done. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Karen answering questions as honestly as she could. She admitted that she had spent countless nights working on the tunnel, often losing track of time. She confessed that she had borrowed tools from neighbors without asking, and lied about the piles of dirt appearing in her yard. She even revealed that she had consulted online forums frequented by survivalists and amateur engineers. Though she denied seeking help from anyone in person, by the end of it, she looked utterly drained, as if reliving her actions had taken every ounce of energy she had left. Before leaving, Greg and the others urged Karen to cooperate with professionals who could assess the situation properly. You can't fix this on your own, Greg told her firmly. We'll call in experts to check the stability of the tunnels and make sure they're not putting anyone at risk. And Karen, please don't try to add to it anymore. This has gone far.
Enough.
Karen nodded reluctantly, though it was clear she wasn't happy about the idea of outsiders poking around her property. Still, she seemed to understand that she had no choice. As the group filed out of her house, they exchanged worried glances. While Karen's intentions may have been good, the consequences of her actions were undeniable and potentially catastrophic. The neighborhood was sitting on top of a powder keg, and it was only a matter of time before something gave way. Over the next few days, cracks began to appear, literally. Neighbors reported hearing strange creaking noises in their basements and noticed gaps forming between walls and floors. One family woke up to find a jagged fissure running diagonally across their living room ceiling. Another discovered that their front porch was tilting slightly, as though the ground beneath it was shifting. Panic rippled through the community, as people realized that Karen's tunnel might have destabilized the entire area. Faced with mounting pressure, Karen finally agreed to let engineers inspect her property. They arrived early one morning, armed with equipment and grim expressions. As they surveyed the damage, their findings confirmed everyone's worst fears. The tunnels had compromised the soil structure, causing subsidence that threatened multiple homes. Repairs would be costly, and the process of sealing off the tunnels safely would take weeks, if not months. Through it all, Karen remained oddly detached, retreating further into herself as the weight of her mistakes bore down on her. She avoided eye contact with her neighbors, rarely leaving her house except to meet with authorities or sign paperwork. The woman who had once ruled the HOA with an iron fist now seemed like a shadow of her former self. But while some felt sorry for her, others struggled to forgive. After all, Karen's obsession with control had spiraled out of control, and now the entire neighborhood was paying the price. As the engineers continued their work, the cracks in the neighborhood, both literal and figurative, grew wider. The once pristine streets of Maple Street now bore signs of stress. Sunken patches of asphalt, tilting lampposts, and uneven sidewalks. But it wasn't just the physical landscape that was shifting. The sense of community Karen had tried so hard to control was unraveling right before her eyes. At first, people were angry, not just at Karen, but at themselves for not noticing sooner. How could they have missed the warning signs? Sure, Karen had always been eccentric, but no one expected her to take things this far. Some neighbors felt betrayed, as though Karen's actions had violated an unspoken trust. Others were simply scared. What if the ground beneath their homes gave way completely? Would they lose everything they'd worked so hard to build? The fear reached a boiling point when Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, an elderly couple who lived directly behind Karen, woke up one morning to find a massive sinkhole forming in their backyard. It started small, a slight dip in the grass, but within hours it had grown into a gaping chasm large enough to swallow a car. Their dog, Max, nearly fell into it while chasing a squirrel, saved only by Mrs. Peterson grabbing his leash just in time. Shaken and furious, the couple packed their bags and moved in with their daughter across town, vowing never to return. News of the sinkhole spread quickly, and soon reporters began arriving on Maple Street, eager to document the bizarre story of the HOA president who dug tunnels under her neighborhood. Camera crews lined the sidewalks, microphones thrust toward bewildered residents. "What do you think about Karen's tunnel?" one reporter asked Greg, who happened to be mowing his lawn at the time. He shrugged uncomfortably, clearly annoyed by the intrusion. "I don't know what to say," he muttered. "It's complicated." Karen, meanwhile, became something of a local celebrity, though not in the way she might have hoped. Her name was splashed across headlines. "Suburban woman builds underground maze beneath neighborhood." And HOA Karen's tunnel project sparks chaos. Strangers drove through the cul-de-sac just to catch a glimpse of her house, snapping photos like tourists visiting a roadside attraction. For Karen, who had always valued privacy above all else, the irony was unbearable. She stayed inside her home, drawing the curtains tighter each day, trying to shut out the world she had inadvertently invited in. But as much as Karen wanted to disappear, she couldn't avoid the growing consequences of her actions. Engineers, determined that the tunnels extended far beyond her property line, weaving beneath multiple homes, including those of some of her harshest critics. This revelation sparked heated arguments at emergency HOA meetings, which were now held in the community center rather than Karen's living room. Tempers flared as neighbors accused each other of enabling Karen's behavior or failing to intervene sooner. "You should have said something," snapped Lisa Martinez, a stay-at-home mom who lived 3 doors down from Karen. She pointed an accusatory finger at Greg, whose backyard shared a fence with Karen's. "You knew she was acting strange, didn't you? Why didn't you stop her?" Greg raised his hands defensively, "Hey, I'm not her babysitter," he shot back. "Besides, when I confronted her, she blew me off. What was I supposed to do? Call the cops because she was gardening too much?" The bickering went on for hours, accomplishing nothing except raising everyone's blood pressure. Meanwhile, outside the community center, workers labored tirelessly to stabilize the ground and seal off sections of the tunnel. Heavy machinery rumbled through the streets, tearing up lawns and blocking driveways. Dust filled the air, and the constant noise made it impossible to ignore the chaos. Life in the neighborhood had become a circus, and there was no end in sight. Amidst the turmoil, Karen faced mounting legal troubles. Local authorities issued fines for unauthorized excavation and property damage, citing violations of zoning laws and safety regulations. Insurance companies refused to cover repairs caused by the destabilized soil, leaving homeowners to foot the bill themselves. Some families, unable to afford the costs, put their houses on the market, but finding buyers proved difficult. Who would want to purchase a home sitting above a network of abandoned tunnels? Karen's financial situation grew dire as well. Between legal fees, fines, and compensation claims from affected neighbors, her savings dwindled rapidly. Desperate, she tried selling off valuables, an antique dining set here, a collection of porcelain figurines there. But it wasn't enough. Eventually, she listed her own house for sale, though she knew it would be nearly impossible to find a buyer willing to take on such a liability. Despite the mounting pressure, Karen refused to apologize publicly. In private conversations, she insisted that her intentions had been noble and that the problems were being exaggerated by overreactive neighbors. "If anything, I was trying to protect them," she told her lawyer during one particularly tense meeting. "They should be thanking me." Her stubbornness only fueled resentment among the residents. At a follow-up HOA meeting, tempers boiled over again. "Protect us?" shouted Tom Reynolds, a burly man who coached Little League on weekends. "You destroyed our homes, Karen. My kids can't even play in the backyard anymore because of the cracks in the ground. That's not protection, that's destruction." Karen sat silently at the back of the room, her face pale and drawn. She didn't argue or defend herself this time, perhaps realizing that any attempt to justify her actions would fall on deaf ears. Instead, she stared at the floor, her lips pressed tightly together as the weight of her mistake settled heavily on her shoulders. As the weeks dragged on, the strain began to show on everyone. Marriages were tested, friendships fractured, and once close neighbors avoided each other altogether. Even the children, usually oblivious to adult drama, picked up on the tension. Playground chatter turned to whispers about Karen's secret cave, and parents found themselves fielding awkward questions about why certain houses looked different now. In an effort to restore some semblance of normalcy, a group of residents organized a cleanup day. Volunteers gathered to repair fences, repaint mailboxes, and plant new flowers in an attempt to reclaim their neighborhood's charm. It was a small gesture, but it helped remind everyone of what they stood to lose if they let bitterness consume them. Still, the scars ran deep, and healing would take time. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Greg stood on his porch sipping coffee and watching the activity next door. Workers were dismantling Karen's shed, preparing to fill in the tunnel entrance once and for all. He felt a pang of sadness, not for Karen necessarily, but for the loss of innocence. Maple Street would never be the same again. Behind him, his wife joined him on the porch, leaning against his shoulder. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" she asked softly. Greg shook his head. "Doubt it," he replied. "Even if she does, I don't think anyone will trust her again. Not after this." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the hum of machinery and the distant chatter of neighbors working together. Despite everything, there was a glimmer of hope, a reminder that communities, like foundations, could be rebuilt stronger than before. But rebuilding required patience, forgiveness, and a willingness to move forward together. Whether Maple Street was ready for that remained to be seen. The situation on Maple Street took an even more dramatic turn when the army showed up. It wasn't just a couple of soldiers in uniform. It was trucks, unmarked vehicles, and men in tactical gear fanning out across Karen's property like ants, swarming a picnic. The sight of military personnel walking through the neighborhood sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, whispering nervously to each other as they tried to make sense of what was happening. Had Karen's tunnel somehow crossed into government territory? Was she involved in something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined? At first, no one knew anything for sure. The Army didn't issue statements or hold press conferences. They simply cordoned off Karen's backyard with bright yellow tape and set up barriers around the perimeter. Engineers and geologists who had been working on stabilizing the tunnels were abruptly dismissed, told that federal authorities would take over from there. Reporters who had been camped out near Karen's house scrambled to get answers, but the soldiers remained tight-lipped, offering only vague assurances that the situation was under control. Karen, unsurprisingly, was nowhere to be seen. Rumors circulated that she had been taken in for questioning. Though no one could confirm whether this was true, some speculated that she was hiding inside her house, too afraid, or too stubborn, to face the consequences of her actions. Others thought she might have fled altogether, disappearing into the night like a character in a spy thriller. Whatever the case, her absence left a void at the center of the unfolding drama, forcing the neighbors to piece together fragments of information on their own. As the days passed, details began to trickle out, slowly, cautiously, like drops of water from a leaky faucet. First came the confirmation that Karen's tunnel system extended far beyond what anyone had initially realized. Initial estimates suggested it stretched several hundred feet underground, zigzagging beneath multiple properties before veering, dangerously close to restricted land near a nearby military base. This revelation alone was enough to send shivers down spines, but it was only the beginning. Geological surveys conducted by the Army revealed something even more alarming. Parts of the tunnel network intersected with buried utility lines and drainage systems, critical to the base's operations. Worse still, some sections appeared to pass within striking distance of classified facilities, areas where sensitive equipment and data were stored. While there was no evidence that Karen had intentionally targeted these sites, the mere possibility raised uncomfortable questions about security breaches and potential vulnerabilities. The presence of the Army transformed the neighborhood overnight. Streets that had once been quiet and sleepy now buzzed with activity. Soldiers patrolled in pairs, their boots crunching against gravel as they monitored the area. Military vehicles parked along curbs, blocking driveways and forcing residents to adjust their routines. At night, floodlights illuminated Karen's property, casting long shadows that danced eerily across lawns and windows. For the people of Maple Street, it felt like living in a war zone, or at least the closest approximation most of them would ever experience. Despite the heightened security, the lack of transparency from officials fueled rampant speculation. Neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, exchanging theories about what the Army was really doing. Some believed they were searching for weapons or explosives hidden deep within the tunnels. Others whispered about secret experiments or covert operations, compromised by Karen's excavation work. A few even joked darkly that aliens might be involved, a nod to the absurdity of the entire situation. Amidst the chaos, Greg found himself reluctantly thrust into the role of unofficial spokesperson for the neighborhood. Reporters frequently approached him, hoping to glean insights from someone who had seen the tunnel firsthand. He did his best to answer their questions honestly without revealing too much, aware that saying the wrong thing could attract unwanted scrutiny. "Look, I don't know any more than you do," he told one persistent journalist. "All I can say is that Karen dug a tunnel, and now the Army is here. Beyond that, your guess is as good as mine." His measured responses earned him respect among the neighbors, many of whom appreciated his level-headed approach during such a chaotic time. But even Greg couldn't ignore the growing unease in the air. As the investigation dragged on, tempers flared once again. People accused each other of withholding information or conspiring with authorities. Arguments broke out over trivial matters, like whose lawn the Army had trampled or which driveway had been blocked longest. The stress was palpable, seeping into every interaction like a toxic fog. One evening, as Greg sat on his porch nursing a cup of coffee, he noticed Lisa Martinez pacing anxiously in her driveway. She looked frazzled, clutching her phone tightly as if expecting bad news. When she finally spotted him, she hurried over, her face pale. "Greg, have you heard anything?" she asked breathlessly. "They've been digging all day and nobody will tell us what's going on. Do you think we're in danger?" He hesitated, unsure how to respond. On one hand, it seemed unlikely that the Army would allow civilians to remain in the area if there was a real threat. On the other hand, the secrecy surrounding the operation made it impossible to rule anything out. "I don't think so," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. "If there was immediate danger, they'd have evacuated us by now. But honestly, Lisa, I don't know what's going on any more than you do." Lisa sighed, running a hand through her hair. It's maddening, you know? Not knowing. I keep thinking about my kids, wondering if we should pack up and leave. But then where would we go? And how could we afford it?" Greg nodded sympathetically. He understood her dilemma all too well. Many families in the neighborhood were facing similar struggles, torn between staying put and seeking safer ground. The uncertainty was exhausting, gnawing away at their peace of mind like termites eating through wood. By the end of the week, the Army released a brief statement acknowledging the presence of potential security concerns related to the tunnel system. They assured residents that measures were being taken to address the issue, though they provided no specifics. Instead, they urged everyone to remain patient and cooperate fully with ongoing investigations. To the neighbors, the message felt hollow, a band-aid slapped over a gaping wound. Still, life went on. Kids returned to school, parents went back to work, and daily routines resumed as best they could under the circumstances. Yet the shadow of Karen's tunnel loomed large, casting doubt over everything. Would the Army find something sinister buried beneath their homes, or would they seal off the tunnels and leave, leaving behind unanswered questions and lingering fears? For Karen, the woman at the heart of it all, the silence was deafening. Whether she was locked away in a detention center or holed up in her house, no one knew. Her name became a taboo subject spoken only in hushed tones. To some, she was a cautionary tale, a reminder of how obsession and paranoia could spiral out of control. To others, she was a tragic figure, undone by her own misguided sense of purpose. Either way, her legacy was etched indelibly into the fabric of Maple Street, a scar that would never fully heal. And so, the neighborhood waited, holding its collective breath as the Army continued its mysterious mission. Each passing day brought new discoveries and fresh waves of anxiety. No one dared to imagine what might come next, but deep down they all knew that nothing would ever be the same again.